Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Vulture's Rainbow Theatre. Tonight we shall be hearing chapters 3 through 5 of The Guns of Sotol Flats, a lurid and disturbing weird western novella by my colleague Michael. We had learned previously in chapter 1 that Billy Ryder and his associate Eduardo Gonzales, also known as El Tiburon, had returned home to Sotol Flats only to discover that a ghost awaited them with a dire message. In chapter 2 we met the imperious Colonel Augustus Billington, preparing to sweep the frontier of Tulixcan rebels, restless tribesmen on the warpath, and an addictive narcotic newly arrived from the mysterious East. What will unfold now for our protagonists, Billy and Eduardo? Let's discover the answer together in chapters 3 through 5 of The Guns of Sotol Flats. The Guns of Sotol Flats. Chapter 3. The Message. Eduardo did not tell Billy what the dead man said for 2 days, not until they were riding south toward the Rio Amargo. It was not until they were deep in the desert on the way toward the border town of Villareal del Rio that the man so much as uttered a syllable. Not that Billy hadn't tried to get the news out of him. A dead man doesn't just come back from the undiscovered country any day, and if such a man has news, Billy figured, it had to be beyond important. "Billy," Eduardo finally said when they were about 15 miles out from Sotol Flats, "I'm going to tell you what Don Jose said. No one should hear this yet, not anyone. Do you understand?" Ryder nodded, looking with some trepidation over his left shoulder. The sun was now on the rise. In a few hours the heat would force them to hunker down behind whatever object might offer them shade. They'd started well before dawn, practically in the middle of the night, using the light of the waning moon's nail-paring to see the Sierra Negras. In particular, they had aimed their horses toward the gap in the range which one could see clearly, even as far away as 50 miles. At the foot of that gap, on the northern bank, the Republic side of the Rio Amargo, stood the village of Villareal del Rio, situated on a hill above the zone of arable land which followed the river. "Don Jose told me that he came to return a favor," said Eduardo. "That bandit we hunted down near Fort Dickerson, if he had lived free one more day, he would have killed the man's great-grandson." "Now let me get this straight," said Billy. "Are you telling me that Don Jose can see into the future? This dead man already knew that Tom Harkins, if we hadn't caught him, was going to gun down his blood kin? How do you figure he would know something like that?" "He explained it to me," said El Tiburon. "And in a crazy way, it makes sense. He asked me, when we were sitting at the table, he said, 'Suppose you are standing on top of that cistern over there by the railroad track. You could see the whole town and all of its crooked streets from there, right?' I said, 'Yes, that's right.' 'Well then,' he said, 'suppose you saw a child playing in the street, just sitting there in the dirt near you, but 2 or 3 streets away you could see a runaway horse coming. The child cannot see the danger from where he is sitting, but you can, because you are in a different, a higher place. You could warn the child, couldn't you?' I said, 'Yes, I could.' 'Well then,' said Don Jose, 'you know what I'm talking about when I tell you that I can see things coming you can't, because the dead don't live in a low spot of time like you. We are situated in a higher vantage point.'" "Okay," said Billy, not used to thinking about metaphysics on the floor of the desert. "So the dead can see ahead to what's going to happen, or maybe to what might happen anyway. Don Jose's grandson might have died, but he didn't, right? Yes, answered Eduardo. You grasped the problem here. The old man warned me about some things that might happen in the future. He did this to pay us back for saving his great-grandson. The air was beginning to get warm, but was still pleasant enough. It would remain tolerable until late morning. Eduardo continued. Ya viene la noche. That's what Don Jose said. Night is coming, he said. It is coming fast, and if you wish to live, you must be ready for it. I hope you asked him to explain that statement just a little more, muttered Billy. A lot of nights have come and gone in our lives, and so far we've lived through all of them, even those 3 nights in the Scotillaria when Santiago and his hunting party had us surrounded. But Chief Santiago could be reasoned with, answered Eduardo. According to Don Jose, what's coming cannot be reasoned with. It is something without mercy, and without ears to hear the pleas of men. The dead man told me that a shadow has fallen over the Western Ocean, that a darkness has come there moving east toward the state of Alhambra. It moves swiftly, and many ships which were expected in the ports of Alhambra will not arrive. Or if they do, men will not welcome the crews which come from them or the cargoes they now carry, not when they see the change in them. Billy thought about Sequoia and her father on their little goat farm down near Villareal. He still didn't understand what Eduardo was talking about, but he could deduce that it was serious, that danger was coming their way in some form or other. He suddenly felt even more helpless than he had the night at the cantina, when he'd sat there with his hands over a useless gun, having a fortune he could not understand read to him. For a moment there he felt fear, felt it exactly like a trickle of icy water down his back. He had been thinking of Sequoia, and now in his mind's eye he could see the card the dead man had laid out for him, the despoiled virgin. That card was based on the story of a woman who'd been raped and killed by outlaws, who had ascended into the heavens to become one of the 7 saints, one of the 7 fingers of God's hand. Did that card have anything to do with Sequoia? He did not like the connections his mind was making. Well, what does he expect us to do about it? Billy asked out loud, his voice betraying a mixture of annoyance and fear. Did he say what he thought would happen next? Yes, Billy, replied Eduardo. Night is coming. It is coming here. He told me that we must be ready to fight, that if we think about it, there are many in this part of the world we can bring together as allies. And he said we should start with El Calvo. You mean that feller who's been raiding over the border? Good luck with that, Billy muttered. From what I heard, he sees you, he shoots you. End of story. He had a sudden horrible thought. Is that why we're riding to Villareal del Rio? Is Baldy coming there? That is what Don Jose tells me, answered Eduardo. He is coming swiftly to the village. It is almost a sure thing that he will raid the farms along the Rio Amargo and north of there. We must find him when he comes and talk to him. If we convince Chief Santiago to spare our lives, perhaps with El Calvo we can... The despoiled virgin, thought Billy. Oh, hand of God and the 7 fingers. Chapter 4. El Calvo. Senator Carlos Seguin never imagined that his life would become the thing that it now was. He had grown up the son of an hidalgo on one of the richest landholdings in Tolixco, had been sent by his powerful and influential father to the continent to attend university. He had come back a cultured young man, ready to assume the responsibilities of the Seguin estates. When the time came, once he had achieved a well-earned reputation for service to his community, once he had served with distinction for 3 terms in the legislature of his own state, he had run for the National Senate and won. Under 3 presidents, he had represented his home state of Colua, had walked the halls of power with other men of distinction and intelligence, and had maintained a spacious and beautiful home in Ciudad Tolixco. He had had a beautiful wife, the daughter of a wealthy family which could trace its pure bloodlines back to some of the noblest families of the Imperio. But in the insurrection of 1226, when an oligarchy of powerful families, supported by more than half the army, invited the Imperio to gift them with an emperor, Seguin had stood loyal with President Gallegos. That loyalty cost him everything. After the coronation of Maxime I, his estates had been confiscated, and his wife, who disavowed him, was granted the annulment of their marriage. He himself, stunned and in tears, had been sought out for arrest. Those loyal to the democracy had fled north toward the Rio Amargo, picking up a following of outraged campesinos, along with those in the army who still supported the Constitution. Seguin went with them. The president, in gratitude, granted him command of a cavalry division. A motley crew they were, too, consisting in part of professional soldiers, in part of tough vaqueros whose fighting spirit and horsemanship were beyond compare, but whose ability to maintain discipline and follow orders was highly questionable. The rest were a collection of shopkeepers and peasants whose main fighting talents at this point were goodwill and loyalty. In the beginning, many of this last group could hardly be said to know one end of a gun from the other. That had changed. So had Senator Seguin. In mourning for the loss of his fortune, his love, and his status, outraged at the subversion of his country to maintain the powers and privileges of noble families against everyone else, he had shaved his head, swearing that not a hair would be allowed to grow upon it, until Maxime I was hanged by the neck and the Constitution restored, along with the rightfully elected president. This act had earned him the nickname El Calvo, which he proudly bore. "Coronel!" he shouted over thundering hooves to his second in command. The division was on the move, galloping swiftly toward the gap in the mountains at Villareal del Rio. "Give the order for scouts to go on ahead. I want to be sure before we make our requisitions that there are no Republican troops in the area." The colonel saluted, slapping the flank of his mount with the reins, goading it into a run toward the vanguard. Through the dust kicked up by countless hooves, he could see the gap ahead of him in the early morning light, a mile or so in the distance. There the road would take them down into the stony hills above the river and its bottomland. If it appeared that no opposition waited on the other side, he would take his troops across its muddy banks, through the green wall of palo verde and bamboo growing along the Rio Amargo there, and up toward the villages and farms which ran along the border on the northern side. His troops needed food, ammunition, medical supplies, footwear, and clothing. The only way to acquire these things in recent months had been through banditry. He despised the need for it, but he saw no choice. If the army of the Constitution was ever to survive and grow in strength, it had to be fed, shod, and armed. Since the Republic evinced no interest in providing assistance to President Gallegos, and since the president depended on the people of northern Tolixco for their support, El Calvo had chosen his victims with dispassionate pragmatism. As the sun got higher and the mountain passed closer, the colonel's scouts returned with good news. The way was clear into the Republic, with no sign of resistance anywhere. They thundered on, now headed downhill, flanked by the stony heights of the Sierra Negra. Below them they could see the undulating hills littered with rock and spiny ocotillo. The brown, twisting band of the Rio Amargo lay below that, throwing reflected sunlight into their eyes. Beyond the river, with its band of high green trees and bamboo, they could see the sun gleaming on the tiled roofs of Villareal del Rio and on the farmhouses in the cultivated bottomland, which extended along the river west and east of the settlement. Seguin nodded at the corporal who rode next to him, the soldier who always carried their banner. The corporal let it unfurl into the breeze where the morning sun shone full on its upper and lower stripes of bright green. In the center field of white was a clutch of 3 red roses, their spiny canes partly covered by a scroll, upon which was inscribed a motto, La Constitución Nacional. With a raised hand, he shouted his division to a halt there on the heights above the river. The words were repeated and carried by his commanders back down the line until the whole unit, armed and mounted, had come to a stop. As always, before a raid, it was his practice to ride up and down along the line, reminding his men of their orders, cautioning them against excesses and outrages committed upon the population. Do not forget, soldiers of the Constitution, that you are not bandits, here to raid, rape, and plunder for your own gain. You are the knights of democracy, the upholders of liberty and the free nation of Torixco. You know what we need. These things only you will take from the people across the river. You will shoot only those who bear arms against you. They will call you bandits and robbers because of the things you do. And in part, they will be right. But remember that this is a part you are acting. Do not become what they call you. I do not wish to hear of rapine and slaughter on the part of my men. Those who forget themselves and their high calling, those who are found to have engaged in such cruelties, they shall pay with their lives. The men listened to this speech in respectful silence as he rode up and down the line, repeating the words until he was certain every man had heard them. Regarding them for a moment sternly, he then drew forth his sword and shouted, La Constitución! The men shouted this back to him as he rode swiftly to the head of his division. Torixco! No te rajes! He cried. And as those words were repeated by his commanders back along the line behind him, the thunder of hooves resumed. They charged toward the river. Chapter 5. The Ranch. Even from a distance, Billy and Eduardo could see that something was very wrong at the Winters Ranch. Situated in a dry, stony valley between 2 buttes, it stood by itself, no near neighbors in view, though the outlying red-tiled roofs of Villareal could be seen further south, a few miles away. There were no signs of life, no flickers of motion to show that man or beast was moving on the place. Arrival at the property confirmed this. Where were the goats? Why were the doors to the stone-built barn and the house standing open? Billy dismounted, turning his horse loose as he ran headlong to the Winters' home. Inside, he found the place in disarray, the beds turned on their sides, the mattresses torn open with the ticking spilled out on the hard dirt floors. A chair from the corner table lay prone, a spot of blood across one of the legs, as though it had been employed to hit someone. Whether it had been used by Sequoia or her father on an invader, or the other way around, he did not know. Cabinets stood open, and every kind of provender they kept in the place, including jars of preserves and bags of feed, were gone. No article of food, no useful tool, no utensil was to be seen. He found a framed tintype of Sequoia and her father, taken by an itinerant photographer with a camera, lying on the floor, the frame still intact, but the glass which had protected it shattered. There was his beautiful Sequoia with her hair combed back. the fancy hat he himself had bought her in Kildare on her head, seated with her white-haired father in his dark suit behind her, both of them with that somber expression the men with cameras always asked for. He picked it up and set it gently on the one table in the house. A kerosene lamp stood there as it always did. Underneath it lay a stack of papers, probably bills of sale and such like. Just then he heard Eduardo's voice from out back calling his name. Eduardo was inside the barn built of stones, held together by mortar that had been nothing other than caliche and soil mixed with water. Sequoia's father, Horatio Winters, and his ranch hands had put the building up some years ago to provide shelter against the hot sun for the goats. In the dark, Billy could see that his partner was hunched over a prone body. When he came up to look over Eduardo's shoulder, he could make out Horatio's craggy, sunburned face, the eyes staring at the ceiling, seeing nothing. He had a gunshot wound to the chest, which had bled profusely, purpling his shirt and the ground under his upper body. The fingers of his hand were curved into the shape of a claw, as if he'd been clutching a rifle. Probably he had been holding his .30-30. No doubt the rifle had been snatched out of his hands. Where was Sequoia? Billy's heart raced as he searched in the shadows of the barn and then ran back outside to see if any other survivors of the ranch lay about the place. Not a soul was to be seen anywhere. It was then that he cast his eye on a stand of cottonwoods which stood out against the dry stone face of the closest neighboring butte. There in the shadows of that butte was the spring which made the ranch possible, which made possible the growth of those trees in the midst of a desolation of dry yucca and ocotillo spreading out south toward the distant Sierra Negra mountains and the muddy river. He ran there, Eduardo now following him so that they arrived almost at the same moment to the place where goat and human alike got their water, where they needed to survive in that waterless place. There they found one of the ranch hands lying on his back with a gunshot wound to the shoulder and another to the left hand, which was trailing in the brown pool of the spring, turning it red. The man was still alive, sweating profusely, the droplets of sweat running down into his bushy black mustache. The man stared up at the sky, his breathing labored, his mind clearly focused on enduring the pain, unable to move much, but stirring a little as if he were trying, in spite of feebleness, to rally himself into a sitting position. No se mueve, amigo, Eduardo said to the wounded Torixqueño. He stripped off his bandana and used it to bind the man's shoulder as best he could. The man had already lost a lot of blood, and the flow needed to be stopped. Billy used his own bandana to stanch the man's hand, gently lifting the campesino's wet arm, laying it across his chest. Eduardo kept talking to him. Oye, amigo, ¿qué pasó? Billy found a dipper lying on one of the rocks around the spring and brought him some of the clean water, not the bloody stuff from the pool. After drinking, the man struggled for a moment to find his voice, and then said, El Calvo, they were raiders, a small group of El Calvo's men. We tried to fight them off, but only the patron, Senor Winters, and me had guns. They killed him pretty quick, but I got to the spring before they chased me down. Did you see what happened to everyone else? Asked Billy. After they shot me, I lay still, the man said. I could hear Senorita Winters arguing with one of the bandidos, so they dragged her off over there to those willows. She screamed for a while, but then she was quiet. Someone shouted at the other men who work here. He told them they could ride with El Calvo or die in the desert. I guess they left with those bandidos. Since then there has been only silence. Shit, muttered Billy, spitting into the mud around the spring. He got up, wanting to run over to the willows, but he found as he approached the rough wall of the butte that trepidation had slowed him almost to a walk. It seemed to take an eternity to reach the stand of trees. He found her propped up against the rock face of the butte then. Her legs spread apart and her skirt hiked up around her thighs, the skirt covering the private area of her body, but only just barely. Her head, its eyes unseeing in death, lay back against the stone, staring blindly at the cloudless sky. Her slit throat bled down the front of her cotton blouse. In the part of the sky where she was looking, a pale sliver of crescent moon could be descried. You have been listening to The Guns of Sotol Flats. Don't forget to check our Vultures Rainbow business page on Facebook to learn future dates and locations of Vultures Rainbow, your mobile home for dark art. This is Damon Vulture wishing you a good night and dark dreams.